Hey guys, it's the Conic. And with launch getting closer and closer, I wanted to create a sort of beginner's guide to making a functional minion build in Path of Exile 2. Now, as a disclaimer, the game is not out and I'll be basing some information with general practices from PoE 1 that are still relevant, as well as some relatively safe speculations from the information we've had so far from creators as well as from GGG. And all this so that come launch you have the tools you need to complete the campaign and at least get going into maps with whatever minion build idea you may come up with. Starting off, we really cannot talk about minion builds without going over the primary resource which will be used to summon said minions, which is Spirit. Now, Spirit is a resource which is reserved to summon permanent minions, as well as a few exceptions it is reserved to summon temporary minions, and it is also reserved to have persistent buffs, i.e. auras in PoE 1. Different minions will have different spirit reservation costs, with more powerful minions typically costing or reserving more spirits, and with higher level gems lowering this spirit reservation for said minions. So the general idea for PoE 2 would be maximizing how much spirit you have and minimizing the reservation cost for each minion to get as large of an army as possible. The first and probably the most important decision you will have to make when creating your build is understanding what playstyle you want it to have. Do you want it to be a hybrid spellcaster minion build where you have some agency with damage? Are you looking for something more along the lines of a full melee build centered around the skeletal reavers? Or is maybe building around cold minions and freezing any mob that comes into rage more your speed? This decision is what will determine not only what minions to use, but also what stats are important for them to have. This decision also feeds into the next thing to consider, and that is understanding what abilities your chosen minions have. The more details you know about their abilities, the easier it is going to be to maximize just how much DPS or utility you are getting from them. As an example, do they use a ranged attack or spell? If it's an attack, then you are going to want to scale a minion accuracy so you don't lose DPS by just missing targets. But if it's a spell, you would want to ignore accuracy altogether and instead scale something else like minion spell damage. On the note of attacks versus spell too, you can probably combine these two types of range minions, but I think you will find more success sticking to either all spell or all attack, just so some minions do not have any wasted stats in the form of like accuracy or spell modifiers not affecting one or the other. Quick reminder to drop a like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. We are only a few subscribers away from our 2024 goal of getting to 500 subs, and with your sub, we can potentially knock that goal out of the park. Another very important thing to note about scaling minions is if a stat does not specifically say the word minion or nearby ally or something along those lines, it most likely just does not affect minion stats whatsoever. I'll give you an example. Increased spell damage on the skill tree or any source of gear does not scale the damage ice mages would do. But if you get a stat called increased minion spell damage, that stat will affect the ice mages. Other really good ways to scale minion damage that may not be as obvious are gem levels, which typically come with a noticeable increase to the minion's damage and survivability, as well as, like I said earlier, a reduction in the reservation costs, so you can have more of them. Minion attack and cast speed, which ends up also being a really big multiplier for minion damage, just because you have more minions attacking, like throwing more attacks in the same amount of time. And depending on the gem in question, the quality could also be a very big multiplier if it has something that would really help the minion. There is also other ways to scale your minions damage with skills I like to call damage enhancers. Now, these do not typically affect the minions directly, though in some cases they do, but they are excellent ways to draw more DPS from them. And now, examples of this would include using a curse. A curse is a spell which would reduce the resistance a monster has towards an element, and in this case you would want to use the curse that reduces their resistance towards the primary element your minions are dealing. So if you're doing cold damage, you might want to use Frostbite, which would reduce cold resistance, as an example. You also want to have a reliable source of exposure, which does the same thing. It reduces enemy resistances and stacks with curses, so you reduce their resistances by even more, giving your minions even more damage. Now, once you've taken advantage of these two sources, you also want to consider what offering you're going to be using, because odds are going to be limited to one offering, save using maybe a unique or whatever. And I personally think Pain Offering looks the most interesting, as it gives your minions a buff. Keep in mind, this is only nearby minions, and by nearby is nearby to the offering spike. It gives those minions increased attack and cast speed, as well as a significant damage multiplier, which would result in a really big gain in DPS, even though to actually cast the offering, you sacrifice the skeletal minion. Now, with all this talk about minion offenses, we best not forget that we need to scale their actual defenses, or our minions are just not going to be alive to do the DPS. For this one, we have to make the decision first on how we want to revive them once they die, because I believe this will synergize heavily with how much defensive scaling we want to give them in our build. Now, there are two primary ways that I am currently aware of to revive dead minions. This could change, but currently I only know two. The first is the default revive mechanic that minions have, and this resummons every permanent minion in your army after a certain amount of time that your army spends without a single death, i.e. minion death. This time by default is 7 seconds, by the way. With this method of reviving, you want to lower that default time by as much as possible, while having maybe beefier frontline minions so that they can take more punishment. And you also would probably want to incorporate a taunt mechanic through either picking a minion that has its base or using a support gem that would give them a taunt. The reason you would want this is you want them to take the aggro from your backline, who are much squishier but would have more damage. With this method, you would probably want to spec a bit heavier into minion life on your tree and potentially gear, just so they don't die as often. Now, the second way of reviving minions is going to be via the skeletal clerics. These guys have an active ability that revives all skeletal minions, and keep note on this fact that only skeletal minions, but this active ability has a 4-second cooldown, and the cooldown is lowered by having more clerics. For this method of reviving, you can probably get away with having a squishier frontline and investing slightly, maybe less, into minion defenses than the first option, since once your minions die, all you have to do is press a button to have them all resummon. But that said, for this to be effective, you would want a way to keep your clerics safe, and this option would be the better choice if you were going for a full skeletal army, since you would revive all your minions. And if you're going for a hybrid army, or like skeletal and non-skeletal minions, then this becomes a worse choice just because of that. That said, you can also incorporate a kind of hybrid setup with the first and the second, since clerics do also heal non-skeletal minions. It's just the active only revives the skeletals, right? So I will probably be approaching this with a hybrid setup, using maybe a cleric or two to keep my beefier minions topped off, because I do not want to have my minions die at every single pack. Now, while we are on the topic of defenses, we do not want to forget that if the summoner dies, it's game over. So you honestly don't want to neglect your own defensive layering either. Now, personal defenses are a much more complicated beast than minion defenses, so I'm not going to go too deep into the topic. Just know that for the best defensive setups, you would want to have some support for 3 major defensive layers. These layers are recovery, mitigation, and avoidance. And by avoidance, I mean damage avoidance, so like think evasion block. So if you can cover these 3 layers, you should be good. And if you're not sure how, there are multitudes of videos that cover defenses in PoE 1 that you could potentially use when making your defenses. Now, at this moment, we can only speculate about what defensive layers will actually be available to summoners. So I recommend you keep your survivability in mind as you play on launch, and just basically play it by ear. That's all we can really do at this point. Now, if you're curious as to what I am doing on launch, feel free to stop by on stream. I'm going to be streaming for a very long time. It has also been revealed that the skill tree will have sources of reduced spirit reservation for minion skills, as well as some increased spirit nodes. So this overall would help you create an even bigger army as you gain levels, so you do not want to miss out on these nodes on the tree. Hybrid builds are also looking more feasible, with more minion damage clusters looking like they also come with spell damage, or for you to have some more damage. So if you're looking for a build which would rely on the player and the minions to deal damage, this is looking more viable in PoE 2 than it was in PoE 1. And as an example, I can give you Raging Spirits. This minion requires the player to cast a fire damage spell or fire area spell to summon said minions. So it will only make sense that the fire damage spell would do damage, as well as the minions, when they get summoned, would actually do damage. So you can potentially use them as an engine for like maybe recovering your mana or whatever, but we're not going to get into that. But anyways, so if this playstyle is something that appeals to you, then I think you can rest assured knowing that it is possible. Come December 6th, I'm going to be streaming for over 24 hours, so do check that out if you're curious about how I approach my minion build. I'm also going to be making a guide when I get whatever it is that catches my fancy to a stage that I am happy with. So keep an eye out for that if that interests you. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything. And if you've made it this far, please consider liking and subscribing, as it helps a lot with the algorithm, yada yada. And with all that said, thanks for watching.